liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, space fans. Welcome to the July 3rd, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Tina Stagg from the Space Association of Australia, and I'm on my own this week, just like Sandra Bullock in Gravity, but with regulation EVA undergarments. So let's get started with some news from our Kiwi cousins. Rocket Lab launched 7 small satellites to orbit on Saturday. The spaceflight startup sent these satellites to low Earth orbit on the company's 7th flight and 3rd this year. Rocket Lab's 2-stage Electron booster launched from the company's New Zealand site, and the satellites were safely deployed about 56 minutes after liftoff. Those payloads include 2 spacecraft called Prometheus, which will be operated by the United States Special Operations Command, and the CubeSat Acrux-1. Acrux-1 was sent into orbit for the University of Melbourne's Melbourne Space Program, an educational organisation that gives Australian students hands-on experience with space projects. LEO Labs announced an agreement recently with the New Zealand Space Agency to provide space situational awareness services. The cloud-based Space Regulatory and Sustainability Platform relies on information from LEO Labs' network of phased array radars to track satellites in low Earth orbit. The mapping and software platform then analyses the data to ensure satellites launched from New Zealand are complying with licensing rules. LEO Labs said the platform was the first of its kind, but expects other national agencies to seek similar services. To US space policy news, the Senate last week approved its version of a defence authorisation bill, including language creating a US Space Force. The Senate passed its version of the National Defence Authorisation Act for fiscal year 2020 by a vote of 86-8. But the Senate approved a space organisation that is somewhat different from what was passed by the House Armed Services Committee, which proposed a Space Corps within the Air Force. Both chambers will have to hammer out a compromise on final NDAA language before a new space service is enacted. To the International Space Station, 3 members of the station's crew returned to Earth last week. The Soyuz MS-11 spacecraft brought American astronaut Anne McClain, Canadian astronaut David St. Jacques, and Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko back to Earth after more than 6 months in orbit. 3 people remain on the station and will be joined by a new crew scheduled to launch on the 20th of July. NASA released a call for proposals last month for access to an ISS docking port for a commercial module. NASA plans to initially fund studies for concept and business development for such a module, as well as early design work. NASA will later select a company to use a docking port on the Harmony module for a commercial module that the agency wants in place by 2024. The solicitation is part of the agency's broader low Earth orbit commercialisation strategy, unveiled earlier this month, that includes increased commercial opportunities to use the ISS as a part of a transition to eventual commercial space stations. To NASA's SLS and Orion program, NASA awarded a contract last week for construction of a second Space Launch System launch platform. Bechtel National Inc. won the $383 million contract for Mobile Launcher 2, a 44-month project scheduled to begin this month. The platform will be designed for the larger Block 1B version of the SLS, which won't launch until at least the mid-2020s. Congress provided funding to build Mobile Launcher 2 rather than to modify the existing mobile launch platform, which is designed for the Block 1 SLS, and thereby avoid possible further delays to the Block 1B version of the SLS. To planetary and space science missions, NASA announced last week it selected the Dragonfly mission to Titan as its next New Frontiers mission. Dragonfly will launch in 2026 and arrive at Titan, Saturn's largest moon, in 2034. The spacecraft, equipped with 8 rotors, will be able to fly through Titan's dense atmosphere, travelling from a landing site near the Moon's equator to a large crater 175 kilometres away over the course of 2.5 years. Scientists will use Dragonfly to better understand Titan's composition and chemistry, which contains the building blocks for life much like the early Earth. To Russia. A battery problem has postponed a Proton launch until later this month. A Proton rocket was scheduled to launch the Spectre RG astronomy satellite last month, but the launch was postponed several hours before liftoff because of a problem charging batteries on the spacecraft. The Russian space agency Roscosmos says the launch will now take place on a backup launch window on the 12th of July, and that the delay won't have an effect on other launches planned from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. To China, continued problems with China's largest rocket could delay a series of major missions. The Long March 5 was slated to return to flight this month, 2 years after its last launch ended in failure, but there has been no sign of the preparations that should be underway if that launch is on schedule. It's now unlikely that launch will take place before September. Continued delays in the return to flight mission will affect other major Chinese projects that plan to use the rocket, including the Chang'e 5 lunar sample return mission and a Mars orbiter and lander mission that is a narrow launch window next summer. China successfully launched a Beidou navigation satellite last week. A Long March 3B rocket placed the Beidou 3 satellite into its planned transfer orbit. The satellite, the 21st of the Beidou 3 system, will be the second to operate from an inclined geosynchronous orbit. India. Indian startup Bellatrix Aerospace has raised $3 million to pursue satellite propulsion systems. The startup, founded in 2015, raised the funding from a group of Indian venture capitalists. It is working on thrusters that use water as propellant, and the company believes it can leverage cost-saving techniques learned by working with the Indian space agency ISRO to be price competitive in the commercial market. To Japan, and the Hayabusa 2 spacecraft will attempt a second landing on the asteroid Ryugu soon. Japanese space agency JAXA announced that the spacecraft will attempt a landing on the 11th of July in a crater the spacecraft created with an impactor in April. Hayabusa 2 will collect samples excavated by that impact during the touch-and-go landing for later return to Earth, joining samples collected elsewhere on the asteroid earlier this month. Project officials said the science benefits the new samples would provide outweighed the risks something could go wrong during the landing attempt. To Israel, Space IL has abandoned plans to make a second lunar landing attempt. The organisation, a former competitor in the Google Lunar X Prize, said days after its Beresheet spacecraft crashed while attempting to land on the Moon in April that it would start work on a second such mission. But in a tweet last week, Space IL said attempting another lunar landing, quote, would not set the required threshold for a breakthrough mission, unquote, that it desired. The organisation will instead pursue a more significant challenge, but didn't specify what that would be. To commercial space news and the United Launch Alliance. An Atlas V launch scheduled for last week was postponed by a battery problem. United Launch Alliance said the Atlas V launch of the AEHF-5 communications satellite would be postponed until the 9th of July because of a failed battery discovered during the final vehicle processing. The satellite is the 5th in a series that provides protected communications for the US military. And finally, the renovation of mission control from the Apollo program is now complete. NASA formally reopened the room last week after years of work to restore the centre to its appearance during the Apollo program. The team responsible for the restoration worked to make it as historically accurate as possible, down to ashtrays and carpeting. The flight controllers who used to work in the centre declared that restoration mission a success. It's just nice to see the thing come alive again, said famed Apollo flight director Gene Kranz. Well, that's the news for this week. Thank you, Andrew, and back to the program.